Viewers and participants, following a more general panel on inclusion earlier this afternoon, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this very first exclusive panel by the Pink Economic Forum. The Pink Economic Forum, or short, the PEF, is an initiative which has been jointly launched by two associations: Network, Switzerland's network of gay and bisexual professionals, as well as by Wybernet, Switzerland's network of lesbian professionals. The PEF's overall objective is to become an independent forum for the discussion and the exchange of ideas regarding economic and business topics in relation to the LGBT community. My friends and co-organizers at Network have been Stefan Griede and Angelo Caltagirone, as well as coordinator Klaus at Wybernet. My name is Simon de Noth, and I will be moderating today's event. The event is entitled The Power of the Pink Economy and the Economics of LGBT Equality, a conversation about progress, fairness, and plenty of business opportunities. So on today's menu, we have three different topics. Firstly, the macroeconomic dimension of LGBT equality, where we hear about why homophobia and transphobia are economically relevant and why it should be in every country's and every society's interest to address this issue. Secondly, we discuss the actual pink economy. What is the pink economy? What is its potential? And why should businesses be aware of it? Lastly, we will hear about LGBT inclusion in the workplace and about companies which are willing to go the extra mile in this regard. And by the way, during the panel, I may just say LGBT rather than LGBT plus or LGBTQI, but I will obviously refer to the entire spectrum of identities, so forgive me for that. While we have a good gender mix on our panel of four, the event is monolingual and will be held in English only. Today, as you can see in the background, we are hosted by the St. Gallen Symposium, which has just before aired another panel here on site dedicated to the topic of inclusion and which featured Dame Inga Biel, who has kindly accepted to stay on and participate in this follow-up panel and is now physically next to me. Also on this panel, but with us online, are Professor Lee Badgett, Justin Nelson, as well as Eric Way, whom I will introduce to you shortly. Before that, just a few more words on housekeeping. The panel is divided in three parts whose contents I just outlined. I will be conducting short interviews with the panelists, which will each take around 10 to 15 minutes. During the interviews already, please all of you feel free to send in your written questions using the Q&A icon function at the bottom of your screen. Please keep your questions as concise and short as possible. There will be no oral live questions, only written questions. Following the interview with our panelists, we have a Q&A section at the very end. I, for my part, will do my very best to fit in and address as many of your questions as possible. We will call it a day at the very latest 7 o'clock local time. But now let me introduce the first panelist in order of appearance. So we've got Professor Lee Badgett. She is an American economist who teaches and researches at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She is best known for her research into economic inequality among sexual and gender diverse populations, including wage gaps and employment discrimination. Her research has also debunked the myth that gay and lesbian Americans are more affluent than straight people. In addition, Lee has testified as an expert witness before the US Congress and other legislatures and has consulted various international institutions on policy issues, including the World Bank. In 2020, she got this excellent book that I have here with me today, The Economic Case for LGBT Equality, Why Fair and Equal Treatment Benefits Us All. It's very much worth reading and obviously most relevant to today's topic. Now, let's get cracking with the questions. Lee, how do homophobia and transphobia harm not only individuals, but entire economies? And so how are they macroeconomic phenomena? And why should every country and every society care about it and try to address this issue?
Well, first, thanks, Simon, for inviting me to be here today. This is very exciting, great panel. And I guess I would start off by taking us down from the macro level down to more like the micro level, let's say. to explain how these connections exist. Basically, when we think about an education sector, for example, schools, universities that LGBT young people go to, and many of us recognize, and some of us have experienced, the kind of bullying, perhaps discrimination by teachers that LGBT young people face. So clearly a bad thing for those individuals. When we think about employment discrimination, again, we think about an LGBT person going into the workplace and perhaps experiencing harassment from coworkers, perhaps running into problems with a supervisor, around issues related to their sexual orientation or gender identity. And that can lead to bad things happening, getting fired, demoted, not getting promoted, not getting hired in the first place, perhaps something that makes a difference in terms of lower wages. So we see that that's, very clearly a really another important human rights issue. And we can think about the fact that we have tons of data now in many parts of the world that shows that LGBT people have health disparities. They do worse when it comes to certain sorts of health conditions than do heterosexual people. So we know anxiety and depression rates are higher for LGBT people. Substance use is higher, HIV is higher, violence is higher, cardiovascular conditions are higher. There are many different kinds of health, mental and physical health conditions that have been shown to be worse for LGBT people. So again, personally, health is a very personal thing at that very individual level. But here's where they connect to the macroeconomy. In each of those areas, we're not just talking about things that matter for individuals, but we're talking about what they bring to our economy. Education is an important source of what economists call human capital, developing the skills, the knowledge, the creativity that really make a big difference in terms of how much people can accomplish in the economy. Harassment and discrimination in the workplace holds back deploying that human capital. It might make it harder to get the kind of internal training that people often need. And health is another example. If you're not healthy, you're not going to be very productive. It's a very simple kind of question about physical energy and capacity to actually do work at one's fullest. So in each of these cases, we can see how these problems at the individual level can scale up to hold back economies overall. So this is an argument I make for LGBT people. You can make this argument for lots of other groups as well, and has been made for about women's participation in the economy, people with disabilities, people who are racial and gender minority or racial minorities. So there are lots of different kinds of layers that we could talk about, but definitely for LGBT people, we know that specific individual treatment of people is holding them back.
Scaling up, you did put some numbers together there. I mean, there was a case study you did in India. Could you tell us a little bit about what you did and what it actually meant? So the non-discrimination or the non-inclusion of the LGBT community in particular, what knock that had on the GDP?
Yeah. So in India, and actually in many other countries that have been studied since then, we can start to put some numbers on that. Actually, the education data we have is not quite good enough to do this, but we can, for example, take people's workplace treatment and estimate how much productivity is lost and scale that up. We can take those health disparities. There are some pretty good figures that monetize what that means for economies. And when I added it up in India, there was a range of results, but basically, looking at India and all the other studies that have been done since then, at least 1% of GDP is lost because of stigma, because of discrimination, because of exclusion of LGBT people. And I can also share that another way we've looked at this really truly is at that macro level. We compared how well the economies do in countries that are more inclusive of LGBT people, where we measured inclusion by having positive laws and no negative laws, and how public opinion, how accepting the general public in those countries are for LGBT people. And no matter what kind of measure we used of inclusion, we always find that that the correlation between inclusion and GDP is very strong and very positive. Even when we then take into account all the other things that matter for determining how successful economies are, LGBT inclusion still matters. Even when we take into account measures of gender equality, it still matters. So we've gone back in time. We've looked at 138 countries in the biggest study, and this pattern is very clear. So there's, both these micro level kinds of evidence and the macro level kinds of evidence about that connection.
But I mean, 1% of the GDP, that's, I mean, any economist would shriek and would be terrified if it was about shrinking or not having 1% of GDP. So it's common sense that we should be addressing that. So my question to you, how should we actually deal with countries that are generally hostile to the inclusion of LGBT people in society? I mean, there is, you mentioned this once, that, there are in certain countries people that would say that the LGBT agenda, in inverted commas, is a neo-colonial project. It's an incursion. So how should one deal with that?
Well, that particular angle is an interesting one. You could also make a very strong case for the fact that that homophobia is an example of neo-colonialism. Many of the laws that criminalize same-sex sexual activity in different countries, especially those in lower income countries, came from the colonial period. It came from their colonizers. So colonies of Great Britain, for example, were very likely to have these, and they even have the same paragraph number, so that was really very much a cut and paste. So, but the important thing I think about the economic argument is that it sends the discussion in a different direction in terms of thinking about what everyone loses from homophobia and transphobia. It sort of pushes a little bit to the side the hot button kinds of perspectives around religion, for example, or the political opportunism that we often see in countries where anti-gay laws are promulgated. So I think it puts it into like a less emotional space in some cases in terms of thinking about the economy. It also opens doors. It means that you can go to places that would not normally think of themselves as, being concerned about human rights. So finance ministries, for example, or development banks, or just financial institutions in general, are going to be much more concerned about these economic effects. And in some cases, those are very powerful actors that have the ability to sway decision makers within countries. So I know that this example has been brought up in many of the places that we've heard about recently. Everywhere from Singapore, which just recently decriminalized homosexuality, to some of the countries that are thinking about these anti-homosexuality bills. Some people call them in Uganda, for example, which just passed one, and that's been introduced in some other countries too. So it's part of that conversation. It's part of the conversation to say, look what you're giving up. 1% seems like a small number, but as you said, I mean, it's basically like it's a self-induced recession. It's saying, it's something that's structural, it's baked into the economy, but we can do something about it. So that's the positive side. But the way to go is not towards these anti-LGBT laws, but much more towards being more having more laws that promote inclusion in our economic sector.
You mentioned the role of multilateral institutions, development banks. What other economic actors in particular, come to mind on this sort of path to greater inclusion of LGBT people around the world?
Well, the business sector absolutely is part of this as well. first of all, they want to be operating in strong economies because they will, they will have more customers and they will have access to a better labor supply if there was more inclusion. And companies themselves were the first entities to make this argument. The business case for LGBT equality has been around for a long time, and companies make it over and over again, very publicly. They say, we need to be inclusive because we need to be able to hire the best workers, to retain them and not lose them to our competitors, and to make them as productive as they need to be in the context of our companies. So there are many companies, for example, that have taken on the issue of marriage equality in many different places. When there have been public votes on that issue in Ireland, in Australia, in Taiwan, there have been companies who've come together and said, we think this is a good idea. We support the idea that LGBT people should have the right to marry, for example. So that's just one example. But we also know that there may be some quiet conversations between big economic actors and policymakers in other countries. So those are also ways to connect the economic argument to what companies care about. They need companies to come to grow from their own economies, but also in some cases to have foreign direct investment that will bring jobs and other kinds of things that will make their economy stronger. So businesses absolutely will play a big role.
I'd like to challenge you on one point. How about the role of universities, academic research? Because you did mention at some point, I think, that there is a lack of numbers and stats in many countries, and that also actually every country on earth is a developing country when it comes to LGBT rights. Where do you see the role of universities as well in the economic framework when it comes to providing stats and numbers?
We have seen, actually, I would say a modest revolution in that area in places where data have become available. So in the United States, we have great data. The UK has been very good at creating data. Canada, Australia to some extent, all from surveys of the population that allow us to identify who's LGBT, and then we can ask these questions about economic inequality or equality. To compare how people are doing. We can ask the questions about where the deficits are that are going to matter for our the health of the overall economy, that macro perspective. So, Europe has taken a different kind of approach, but we're starting to get more data there. Much of that comes from administrative sources instead of surveys, so it's a little bit more complicated. But so I think university professors are eager to play an active role in identifying these issues. We just do need the data, and so data are a big issue. And I think this is something that multilateral development agencies can take on. The World Bank has been doing some data collection. The Asian Development Bank is talking about doing some in some of the countries that they work with. There's a recognition that data play a really important role, and so that's wonderful to see. And I think that makes it possible then to build up the other parts of what should we call it? The research infrastructure in the world to encourage people to use that data, to make sure they're safe in using it. Safety is a big issue in terms of both collecting the data and even in analyzing the data for researchers. So we want to make sure that there are good, safe environments for people to do that data collection and the data analysis. But if you build it, we will come when it comes to data.
And of course, you have been spearheading this for many, many years. Thank you very much, Lee. So I would now like to move to the next section, to the topic of the pink economy. Let me just introduce Justin Nelson first. Justin Nelson is the co-founder and the president of the US National LGBT Chamber of Commerce, NGLCC. He has been an influential voice of the LGBT business community for over 20 years now. At the helm of the NGLCC, Justin turned his organization into a formidable and highly active advocacy machine which brings together the LGBT business community and which has successfully championed the cause of supplier diversity as well as the certification of LGBT businesses. Also, the NGLCC has set up a global network of LGBT chambers of commerce, of which Switzerland is unfortunately not part, as we do not have such a chamber yet, at least not for now. Now, Justin, in your view, what is the pink economy?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation to be here virtually. Next year, I think all three of us would be happy to make our way to Switzerland for a few days. So keep that in mind for next year's invitation, Simon. You know, for me, it's really two-part. One, it is what we put into the economy as consumers. Two is what we put into the economy as business owners and employees. And I think both are incredibly important. And just a couple of numbers. And, you know, globally, LGBTQ people have a spending power nearing $4 trillion US, which is incredibly important. The United States alone, it's around $1.4 trillion that we put back into the economy through products and services that we purchase. What is our buying power? And for a long time, that's how people looked at us. But before that, they looked at us, decision makers, as just LGBTQ people. When we first started this dialogue, 30 years ago, it was just as gay people. They didn't know that we were employers. They didn't know that we, in our country, were the groups of people that offered healthcare. They didn't know that we were taxpayers, that we were a part of the economic fabric of our economy. And so then, 30 years ago, they started to look at us as consumers, realizing here's a group of people that have money, and much to the great work of Dr. Badgett, there is a myth of LGBT wealth, but it is a difference in how we spend those dollars that we do accrue. And so companies largely started looking at us as consumers. We evolved, like many movements, if you will, have. So it went from just being marketing to how do you treat your employees? How do you attract and retain employees? And then when we came on the scene, it was really about what we add to the economy as small and medium-sized enterprises. What are we doing in terms of employment, in terms of a tax base, in terms of our own GDP? And there had not been numbers done on that. So we commissioned a study back in 2017. We'll do an update on it this year. We planned on doing one a little bit sooner, but COVID kind of got in the way of that. And I'm not big on having big, huge discrepancies in the data that we're producing. But we wanted to take a look at who we were as economic contributors to the economy. And so we commissioned a study working with our friend Bob Whittick at Whittick Communications that for the first time looked at who LGBTQ small businesses are and what we add to the economy. And the estimation that came out of that study was around $1.7 trillion to the US economy from the estimated 1.4 million LGBT-owned companies. And to put that on a map for folks in the audience, that would make the LGBTQ small business community the 10th largest economy in the world. And to sort of draw the parallel between what Lee mentioned earlier around the 1% of GDP, I would make the note that what country would discount the 10th largest economy in the world? So for us, the pink economy is really the yin and the yang. It is what we put in as consumers, but it's also what we put into the economy as job creators and economic engines that help our local, state, national, and now global economies run.
I would like to just ask you a question also about the institution that you co-founded. Back in the 70s, there were LGBT business associations, but it is correct if I'm not wrong, the NGLCC was the very first LGBT chamber of commerce in the world, founded over 2 decades ago. You were the first chamber of commerce.
The first national chamber of commerce. Again, yes, some of the organizations that have now become affiliates and really grown into a chamber of commerce from a business association were in existence. In fact, I was just on a call yesterday with our friends at the Golden Gate Business Association that will celebrate their 50th anniversary next year. But in terms of really looking at what a chamber of commerce does, that was in GLCC now nearly 20 years ago. And we did that because sort of the same reason I talked about how I see the pink economy. We had a lot of great social justice advocacy groups doing great social justice work, but nobody was looking at the economic side of things. And I look back now, 21 years later, we were founded in 2002, and I think about sort of the almost disdain that was held for us and our dialogue around, the economic argument. I'm a firm believer. I believed it 21 years ago. I believe it today. You can't have equality if you don't have equity, and you can't have equity if you don't have opportunity. And that's why we founded NGLCC, was to talk about the things that people weren't talking about the economic indicators, about the economic impact of businesses, about the ability to provide for your family. LGBTQ families have families as well. And if we don't have strong businesses and strong opportunities, then we don't have that opportunity to put forward issues that are most important to all of us, I believe. And that's the ability to live free of discrimination, love the person that we love, and create a financial stronghold that will allow us and generations to flourish.
So a very important activity of the NGLCC is the certification of LGBT-owned businesses. Could you tell us a little bit about that? How does it work?
Sure. I think a lot of things we have maybe been first to market or the original creator on. We are not on certification. It's been around in the United States for over 50 years. It really started out of an issue with our U.S. Department of Transportation and contracts that were problematic or being problematic for people of color to attain. And so out of that came an organization called the National Minority Supplier Development Council, which certified and continues to this day to certify ethnic minorities in the United States. These are businesses that are at least 51% owned, operated, and controlled by a ethnic minority or minorities. We followed suit with that. In fact, the second certification group was for women. We came on the scene with our program now over a decade and a half ago, but it is to certify LGBTQ-owned businesses that are at least 51% owned, operated, and controlled for the purpose of becoming a part of the diverse supply chain of major corporations. And to give you an idea of sort of how this trajectory has happened over the last 2 decades, we started with one corporate partner, that was IBM, 20 years ago. We now work with over 450. So almost all of the Fortune 500 and many of the Fortune 1000 companies accept our certification. And literally billions of dollars have been spent now between our corporate partners and certified LGBT-owned businesses in the United States. And these are everything from cybersecurity to, building a parking lot. I mean, I always get a chuckle, and I get less of it now than I did 10, 12 years ago about what is an LGBTQ business, because then everyone thought it was a flower shop or a hairstylist, and they're wonderful businesses, both of them. But we truly are everything from aerospace and engineering to landscaping and marketing. It is everything. You take a slice of small business America, and you have a slice of small business LGBT America. And now so many of our corporate partners are looking at how they create similar programs in countries where they have major operations. So for us, now working as part of NGLCC Global, one of our divisions, we've helped to establish and affiliate with 25 global affiliate chambers across the world, representing 40 countries on 5 continents. So it truly has gone global. And we're working with each of these individual chambers to create a similar type certification or registration program where there is an infrastructure of multinationals that are looking to do this sort of economic impact work in their community, not just with LGBT, but with women, people with disabilities, indigenous communities, so on and so forth.
So you've well and truly gone global. I mean, so you've helped set up and you've accompanied 25 LGBT chambers of commerce around the globe, but surely it hasn't all been smooth sailing. Tell us a little bit about the challenges. I understand that you tried to set up, or you in the process of setting up one in Japan, and there was just not disbelief, but there wasn't the same level of willingness to set one up. Like, why do we need one in the first place? Can you tell us about the challenges?
Yeah, I think challenges are probably not going to surprise anyone. I think funding is always a challenge. Finding community buy-in, where a particular country is in their evolution around LGBTQ rights, and what sort of laws are on the books, and maybe just what sort of cultural acceptance, where they are in that journey. You know, we often say, and we get a lot of calls from a lot of countries wanting to have us help them start a chamber. And if there is not some baseline bubbling, if you will, of an equality movement, we are not the right group to come in and help jumpstart that piece. And I think it's really important that people know when and where is the right sort of market for the kind of organization that you're going to start. So I think that's one particular item that's incredibly important, is knowing where a country is in its evolution, or is there a baseline equality movement and discussion that's happening in that country? And then two, are there businesses still in so many of our countries? It is a real challenge, frankly, here in the United States. You know, there's a big difference between being certified and how you feel that can impact your business in the Castro in San Francisco than it is in downtown Mobile, Alabama. So there are all of those sorts of things that go into it. And then you really do have to have a commitment of support, financial support, but also subject matter expertise, thought leadership, and a commitment of a group of founders and a founding board of directors that are going to see it through to, you know, not just from the design center, but to the launch pad. I think those are probably the biggest challenges. They're not insurmountable. I think we continue to see success. I'm in Brazil right now. I was here for our Brazil Chambers Conference last week. I've been in Ecuador prior to that for our first ever chamber event with the Ecuadorian chamber. And so it's very interesting when we start talking about economics and economic impact to even just go back to what Dr. Badgett said earlier. When we start looking at things in that context, what are we missing out on by not being inclusive? It's amazing who starts to show up at these events. So, you know, it is a bite of the apple at a time. We're not trying to eat the whole thing, but it is making sure that decision makers, that policy makers, that private sector leaders start to understand that. And then that's when you see things really take off. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much. And I would now like to move to the third and last section of this conversation, LGBT equality in the workplace. We have touched on this in the previous panel this afternoon. But first things first, I'd like to just introduce the two panelists here. I have, in order of appearance, I have Eric Way. Eric Way is a global head of inclusion, diversity, and CSR at the Swiss Schindler Group, and which most of you should or must know, because most of you would have been transported in one of their lifts or escalators at some point. Eric has a dual background in engineering and HR. He's responsible for driving the Schindler Group's global inclusion and diversity strategy. Also, in today's panel, he will be able to tell us a little bit about the current process of Schindler's labeling situation with the Swiss LGBTI label, which is a label powered by Network and Wybernet. Previously, Eric held positions in the car industry, including Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Volvo. Eric is originally from the US, but has lived in Lyon, France, for over 3 decades, which now makes him European as well. And then I'm going to also, in one go, I'm going to also present the the fourth panelist. Last but certainly not least, we have Dame Inge Biel on the panel. Inge is an accomplished international business leader with 4 decades of experience in global finance and global financial services. She's also a pioneer and a role model for inclusion in the business context and uses her experience with homophobia to encourage people or companies to better support LGBT employees. Currently, Dame Inge is the chair of Mediclinic International, a South African company to which the Swiss Hirslanden Group belongs. So I'm sure some of you will also be familiar with the Hirslanden Group. And she is president of the British Swiss Chamber of Commerce, BSCC. Previously, she was the CEO of the insurance giant Lloyd's of London. We heard that in the previous panel. And when taking on that role around a decade ago, Inge became one of the very first openly out LGBT CEOs of any major international institution. And a mover and a shaper she is indeed. A few years ago, the Financial Times named her one of the 30 most influential people in the City of London. Now, back to Eric. I would like to ask you, so in 2020, the Schindler Group obtained the Swiss LGBTI label by Network and Wybernet. Could you briefly explain what this label is and what the reflections of the Schindler Group were before applying for this label?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. It's been a real journey for the Schindler Group. We started our work with inclusion and diversity, and it was actually more of a diversity focus back around 2015, 2016, very gender focused. And as this developed, at the time, we didn't have a position for a head of inclusion and diversity. It was a bit of a group effort, people wanting to come together into a committee and try to move things along incrementally. And the top leadership started asking, well, shouldn't we widen the scope of what we're talking about in terms of diversity beyond gender? And I can remember even at the time, our head of HR went to a board meeting and had a pride-colored tie on because the discussion was around how we're going to widen the scope of our work with diversity and inclusion. At the same time, there were groups of employees which were very enthusiastic about wanting to be more visible. It was something that I think was sort of taken for granted that we're a respectful organization. This is true, I think, with a lot of companies. Why do we need to talk about this? If it's, I don't see any problem. That's often what we hear. We respect everyone. Isn't this a personal issue? And so it was really to kind of break through that barrier. And at the end of 2019, we started the process, and the role that I'm in now was created at the beginning of 2020. And so what the label does, I think, these types of labels that we find in different countries are really helpful because they give a bit of a grid, to measure ourselves with, to see, what is your engagement in the organization? What are you actually doing in terms of initiatives? Are you communicating about this? Are you allowing employees a means of having an alert, a whistleblowing, some type of retribution for, is there a policy that covers LGBT inclusion, all of those aspects? So, going through the process the first time, it raised kind of the weak spots at that time. And one thing that I've been very excited to see in terms of an evolution is how we've increased our communications. Our certification is, it's country specific, so it's for our operations in Switzerland. And it's been, central Switzerland, it's a little bit conservative, let's say, and if we look compared to Europe in general. So it's been very interesting to see the company, reach out boldly by sponsoring a pride event in central Switzerland. We were participants in a trans rights or human rights campaign with one of our technicians, who I loved it, one of our technicians who stood there with the sign, trans rights or human rights. And you actually look and you're wondering, is this person transgender or are they a straight ally? And I love the fact that we don't know, that this person was bold enough either way to stand up there and do that. So this is a little bit of what's been the motivation behind going for the label.
How about, so a bit of stock taking? What are the findings at your company? What have been some of the findings? Have you been able to attract new talent, for example, or You are in the process of, well, getting relabeled. It is a 3-year operation, a 3-year, not operation to get relabeled, but it is a 3-year labeling. So what's the current status now at the Schindler Group?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've, the recertification process is a chance to take stock and see where we've increased. And I think on the communications is probably the area where we increased the most. Another very helpful comment we got the last time was, you don't really have any restroom facilities that are gender neutral, and again, that was helped us to have the conversation internally. We haven't had a request for this. Why is this need? The conversations you have with the facilities person. And we talk about how, inclusion, true appreciation of differences means we are proactively making space for people to be themselves. So it's not until we have a demand that we're going to offer facilities that are gender neutral. We want to show that we're proactive in that area. So that was one of the advancements. Again, the communications. We don't really know exactly what, we don't keep statistics of what people might refer to in terms of joining the company, but anecdotally, we can say that very many people, we just hear comments about people being proud to work for a company, that here I have the rainbow flag behind me next to our logo, that they're just very proud to be a part of it, whether they're LGBTQIA plus identifying or not. They really feel proud to be with a company that takes a stand in that way and is working to break the taboo on these topics. And what's also important is, even though the label is only for our Swiss operations, we put it on our group websites because we really want to show all of the rest of the organization of Schindler globally that this is not a taboo subject. This is a subject that we address globally. And we set the example at our headquarters location, and then we're seeing the subject being developed in other countries where there are varying levels of maturity on the topic.
Thank you, Eric. And now I'm going to turn to Inge next to me here. So we've heard this afternoon, we've heard that already. So 10 years ago, you became the CEO of this very large international institution, the insurance giant Lloyd's of London. The first female CEO of that company, whose history spans more than 300 years. Am I right in assuming that you would have made your company apply for the LGBTI label had there been such a thing back in 2013?
I wish I'd been a bit smarter. I would love to have been smarter, and I tell you why, because I have thought about this even before this discussion and learning about this certification. Because we proudly declare the board, the group executive committee, we proudly declare their nationality and we proudly declare their age. It's usually nearly always out there, right, on every publication. You usually, by looking at the photos and perhaps by looking at some of the names, you can tell what gender someone is. But when I was there at Lloyd's, I never ever thought of trying to identify how many of our senior leadership were from the LGBT community, and I wish I had. First of all, I would love now, looking back, because I retired at the end of 2018, looking back, I think, oh gosh, why didn't I just think of having little pride flags by the names of the individuals, say on the executive committee, who were out about their sexuality like that. And I just wish I'd had something, and this, something like a certification program, I mean, it adds such credibility to something. And it's interesting because I was thinking about what happened in the UK around gender equality in financial services, which financial services has not been strong at. And if you look at the gender pay gap, financial services are the worst sector, along with the construction industry, for a gender pay gap. I mean, it is awful. But anyway, I look at the work that was done. It was spearheaded by the UK government. It had many, many financial services, the major banks, major insurers involved. The outcome at the end of that was, okay, to get change to happen around gender equality and even openness and declaration about your gender differences, let's have a charter, and for any company that wants to sign up and have that as an accreditation, they have to comply with certain things. One of them is they have to have targets to raise the percentage of women in their senior leadership, and they have to have executives bonus, so variable pay, impacted by meeting those targets. Now, at the time, that was done some years ago, I had a few challenges getting the board to agree to sign it, but we did sign it, and that meant we had to commit to those things. Just think if there was something like that also around LGBT. I would have jumped at something like that, a certification, something where you actually had a sort of some official stamp that you were doing something about it, because you then had to report against your targets.
How would your colleagues in the board have reacted to that then?
Well, they were. I had to work on a few of them around the women thing. The gay topic would have been something a little bit more delicate. And I say that because I remember the second year I was in office at Lloyd's, we launched what we called the Dive In Festival. And it was a festival about diversity and inclusion. And in the first year, it was just in London, all around where Lloyd's is. And it was an idea coming out of the Inclusion at Lloyd's initiative, which I was, we were spearheading at the time. And we decided to have 3 days of celebration about diversity and inclusion, start conversations, have insightful discussions about it. And I always remember asking my chair at the time, who'd always boasted how he knew Lord John Brown, the ex-BP CEO. And he always said, oh, I know John. I said, oh, well, would you ask him if he would come and speak at one of our events? And my chair looked at me and said, oh, I've never talked about that subject with him, And I said, well, it's okay, but just ask him if he'll come and talk to the LGBT community. He did do it. I bet he didn't mention LGBT, gay, or anything. He just probably fumbled around and asked them to come and talk at our Diversity and Inclusion Festival. Because sometimes when you're not part of the community, you can be very fearful, worried about broaching things, saying the wrong thing. So, and it's, I don't know, people seem to be okay with the gender topic now, but when it comes to being gay and talking about that openly around the board table, around the executive tables, I still don't think everyone is as comfortable.
What would you say to criticism that sort of claims that pointing this out in such a way can lead to sort of division rather than collective, the whole together? So more tribalism and division rather than inclusion, or rather than the collective sort of society. How would you address that? How would you respond to that?
Well, we know that happens to a certain extent. Being a woman, I know that throughout my 40 years, I can often be in a situation where I am already noticed as being a bit different. I can remember the Geneva Association is the largest association formed from Geneva many, many years ago. It has the 80 or 90 largest insurance CEOs as members from the world. Mm-hmm. I was the first CEO, I was first a CEO in 2006. I went to attend this event. I was the only female sitting around the table of 80. Right? Now, I felt like a complete outsider because the men have this natural cohesion. So I know that we have these natural cohesions, these natural tribes forming everywhere we go. Now, because of the LGBT community not necessarily going out with their pride ties on or whatever it is, often it's hidden and it's not known about. So the tribalism doesn't happen, but I tell you it happens in all sorts of other places. I can remember going to Singapore and hosting a big party in Singapore for Lloyd's opening a brand new office. You could see by the groups mingling in the cocktail party afterwards, boy, you could see by the colour of their faces and you could hear by their accents. Everybody was gathered with like-minded or people from their own community that they felt somehow safe with. So this happens all the time. I don't believe highlighting this is going to be bad, though, because it happens naturally. Let's get it out in the open, and then we can start doing something about it. We can get people to understand differences, be curious about differences. And when I was at Lloyd's, one of the key things I was trying to do all the time was, if we had an employee resource group, I wanted to find someone not from that group to be the sponsor. And I can remember going to the straight white man, would you please be our sponsor of our pride group? And first of all, the fear in his eyes, what do I say? What do I do? I said, just come along, be curious and learn. And then, of course, he ends up being the best sponsor because he's now enriched his life because he's got an understanding of community that he had no idea about before.
So allyship is the winning strategy.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I've used it many times. Mm.
Now, you have told us a little bit about your career and all of the lowlights and in your childhood as well, the difficulty, the differences that made you realize that difference is part of our human existence as well, but that it can very much characterize ourselves. But what would you say, what has actually made you break through this double glass ceiling, I would call it, double glass ceiling over this time? But what have been the strategies there?
Well, I'm not a very strategic person when it comes to my own life. I go with the flow, but when I think about what's happened, I've had some major chapters, I guess. When I started work, I thought I was a heterosexual woman fighting in a man's world. That was how I sort of perceived myself, and everything, all my energy was about how, fighting these men, if you like. Then I had a phase when I started to date women. Oh, now I'm a lesbian. Wow. And I was in the closet for years about it. And again, when you get moved around countries, this can have an enormous impact on you when you're not out about your sexuality. I don't think we've touched on it yet, but I remember moving from the UK to the US, not being out about being with a partner. So what did we do? We secreted her into the country ourselves. We moved to the state of Missouri. They didn't recognize same-sex relationships. The only way I could get her to be able to accompany me was to she registered in a university, did another university degree. It was the only way that we could, in our little world, without our employer helping, that she was able to be with me. I did that time and time again, everywhere I went to different countries. I mean, absolutely ridiculous. But they're the sort of things you did. So it's almost as though you, despite all of this, I still made it through my career. And then I had my sort of last chapter. My wife at that time, after 12 years, she left me for a younger woman. I found myself with a man, and now I'm married to a man. And then I've got another label. Now I'm in my bisexual phase. The first thing that happened was all my lesbians rejected me and said, well, you don't belong with us anymore. So, wow, this isn't easy stuff for any of us to deal with. But despite all of that, somehow it made me stronger. But what it did do was when I did get opportunities, I took them. Even if I got offered a job because I was a woman and they needed a woman, I took it. If they wanted me because I was bisexual did Lloyd's want to have the first bisexual CEO? No, of course they didn't. I didn't get hired for that. But when I was in that role, I made sure that I was going to be a voice for that community so that I could use my influence to make it a better place. And somehow this feeling that you can help others have a better, more opportunities in their life, that was sort of the spur for me to keep going against some pretty tough challenges.
Thank you very much for sharing that story. Now, let's look forward. 10, 20 years from now, where do you think things will stand in the workplace in terms of LGBT acceptance? How likely is there also going to be a backlash against increasing LGBT inclusion? Or will there be, on the contrary, a lot more LGBT CEOs in the years to come? Not that that is the only yardstick, of course. Where do you think things will stand in 10, 20 years from now? Let's say 10 years, 20, 30, even less than 10 years. That's a sort of a time horizon we can sort of picture. Inga, what do you think?
Every change goes through ups and downs. So if I think about the journey we've been going on, making great progress, we go back a little bit, but we will make progress in the longer term. This is what I fundamentally believe. But right now it's a bit worrying. Well, I would say perhaps more than a bit, it's very worrying. The UK has gone back in its rankings on LGBT rights and things. The US, goodness knows, I mean, we've got US experts here who can talk about some of the things that are happening there. It really worries me. I saw in the UK post the Brexit vote, the hate crime against the LGBT community shot up. What's LGBT and Brexit got to do with it? Well, it hasn't, but somehow it unleashed people's ability to go out and say, I hate you, and be rude to people. And it's a really worrying time, I feel. And some of the people that I know still from the LGBT community who are not out at work, people in their 50s, I go, why don't you have the courage to be out at work? Please be out at work. Because unless we have more people coming out, we can't help others come behind us. And when I arrived at Lloyd's, the only way we could tell about someone's sexuality was if they completed a voluntary field on the employee engagement survey, which we did every year. And when I arrived, less than 10% of the employees completed that field. I start talking about this whole subject, inclusion more broadly, we want to know. Within a year, over 90% of all the employees completed that field. And then the next year, we discovered, because then you're able to use the data, that our gay men were the happiest, most engaged community in Lloyd's. So you can do things, but you need to keep being proactive about it. Business leaders need to be out there being proactive. Governments, we have to keep doing stuff, because otherwise I fear we can always take little steps back.
Lee, would you like to chip in there? How do you see this sort of this backlash? Or we all have to be vigilant, obviously, but how do you see this this turn of events, and can you see this pendulum swinging back after decades of a march of progress? Where do you see things?
It's a great question. I think in a lot of ways I agree with Inga that right now we are at this very challenging moment in the US. Hundreds of bills are being introduced into state legislatures that would represent steps back in many different ways, but in particular against young transgender people, which is just devastating for them. So we're going to face challenges. We cannot take progress for granted. And we can't assume that once we get started down a path of progress that there won't be resistance to it. So, I think those are the lessons. Actually, a lot of historians would have told us that, like, you should have known that. But now we're seeing it get played out. I think the polarization that we see in different countries will probably continue. At the same time, there are many more, I would say an increasing number of pressures that are going to pressure for progress that cut across countries. Businesses are a big part of that. Multinational companies who want to have the same policies for all of their employees are grappling with this issue, even for a long time in the past, and will continue to do that in the future. But they are a force for change. The ecosystem of LGBTI organizations is also not shrinking. It is, if anything, it's increasing. We're recognizing new directions to go. People are connected. People are talking about the challenges that we face around the issues around the shrinking space for civil society, the issues around challenges to democracies in many parts of the world. These are all things that will affect us. But I think it's clear that there's the movement towards equality, the need for equality, the energy going to move us towards equality will not go away. LGBTI people are here and are ready to keep fighting. So I don't have any doubt that these issues will continue to be on the front burner.
Justin, do you have anything to add to this? So you're representing a growing, successful organization, but what about the bigger picture?
Well, I think we need look no farther than what the Florida governor has done and is really, I don't know, ill thought out battle with Disney Corporation. There will be books written about that, and I don't think they will be favorable towards Governor DeSantis. I think what Lee said is exactly right. And for me, I think the business community and their ability to stand strong and stand behind this is incredibly important. It's very interesting on some of this because, there's been this almost absolutist pledge from some in the activist community to try and expel the greed of corporate involvement. Yet corporate involvement really has helped push us to the point that we are in terms of this movement. And I really liked what Lee said earlier about the quiet conversations that happen, because not all of them play out on the front page of the Orlando Sun-Sentinel. Some of them play out in a boardroom, in quiet conversations where companies that truly help move national economies are staying true to the vision of equality, because it's not only the right thing to do, but it means their ability to move quality key employees around the world and impacts their ability to do the work that they need to do. So I think, I see it as we'll continue to take steps forward, and we'll continue to get kicked back a step or two. I don't see this as something that's going to fade anytime soon, but I think we need, as long as we all stay unified in this argument and this fight on the business side of things, I think we'll continue to persevere. It won't be an easy battle, but I think we'll continue to move forward.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a most enlightening or engrossing conversation. I would now like to move to the last part of this panel, or of this webinar, the Q&A section. So please, all at home in front of your screens, please send in your questions, and we will answer them. But until such time, I will hand over to people who are with us here in the room and who may want to ask a question. I am looking at my colleague, Stefan, and please, all of you, don't be shy and hand in your questions.
Can I have the mic? Thank you. This is a question for Lee. When I look at the world map, and I look at countries like, let's say, Saudi Arabia or the Iran, or I don't know, the Philippines, countries that are not very famous for diversity and inclusion, to say the least, I note that they don't have many patent applications. And I wonder whether there is a scientific approach, or whether it was researched, whether there is a link between the grade of innovation in a society and its openness to all kinds of people.
Great question. I will say that there's at least one study that shows that kind of some higher level measures of how innovative countries are has shown a strong correlation with LGBT inclusion. And there's a great study in the United States that actually did a very careful analysis of what happened when states passed non-discrimination laws. So for a long time we had, I think right now we still only have about half of our states that have passed non-discrimination laws, including sexual orientation and gender identity. We now have a federal protection, but before that, states were kind of doing their own thing one at a time. And what this study showed was that people who produced lots more patents, and especially patents that were widely cited, which is a measure of quality, were moving into the states that passed sexual orientation and non-discrimination laws, sexual orientation and gender identity non-discrimination laws. So there might be some really interesting ways that people could use that patent data looking across countries. I don't know enough about it to say how well that would work, but it's a great marker.
Thank you, Lee. Angelo?
I have another question for you, Lee. You were talking about people are discriminated, and they get ill and they get depressed and stuff like that. I'm the former president of an Italian LGBT organization, and we organized 10 years ago a convention about how much homophobia costs for the society. And I was struck by something, a factor that I never thought about it, and it was the cost not only on loss of productivity, but also the cost of health care. I mean, all these people need to be addressed. They need health care, and in that case, we are not. Nobody is discriminated. In most of the country, healthcare is free. So the society has to pay for their healthcare because they are discriminated, and so it is still like that. I mean, it's a factor that impacts also the cost of homophobia in the society.
Yeah, what a great observation. Absolutely, the cost of healthcare has to be borne by someone. And in the US, it's often companies because it's part of our compensation. In other countries, it's national health systems. But and I think in addition to those costs, I think what the COVID epidemic really made us realize was how bound up our health is with everybody else, right? It was an infectious disease, so of course you can catch it from one another. But it also meant that the stresses on our healthcare systems meant that some people got care and some people might not have gotten the care that they needed. So it just shows how closely tied we are to everyone else in the places that we live. Our health depends on the health of other people. So it's a great point.
I have a question here from the audience, and it's one that I would imagine is also one maybe that Professor Badgett will be able to answer. How do you push LGBT equality within multinational companies when they have offices in intolerant countries? How do you make it safe for staff in those places, and when there's a real danger for them, obviously, while remaining true to their mission? I remember you talked at some point about the embassy model and other ways of companies how they can engage abroad in different countries. But what is a safe strategy for people, and what should they do, those companies, multinationals?
Well, actually, I was going to ask Eric and Inga that question, so maybe you should go to them first.
Well, okay, fine. Well, Eric, please. How does Schindler guarantee the safety of its staff in Saudi Arabia, say?
It is a very complicated question, and it's one that has, I would say, I've heard certain simplistic remarks coming from places where they don't quite understand the global context. And so it's something where we need to tread very lightly. For instance, if we go into a country, and we don't have to go as far as Saudi Arabia, to be honest. I had in a previous position, along with another Swedish company, we created a call for boycott of Swedish products in the country of Poland, due to our work with LGBT topics. And it was a very subtle situation, but in any case, if we go into a place where we know that there is going to be a high level of resistance, by creating a lot of communication on the topic, we're going to create a backlash, and that's actually going to create a negative impact for the employees. So it's really important, and often what can be very difficult is we don't have a reference group in those countries because people are not willing to come forward. So one of the advantages of having our employee networks is that a lot of times people are just happy to be able to belong to this network. They're very reassured that it exists. So I'd say from a psychological safety point of view, having clear policies globally, having employee resource groups where people can connect to globally, even if it's just virtually or on a mailing list, gives them a reassurance about this. And then that in some cases, we're able to get input from those places to know what would you like, what would be appropriate. At times I've been in situations where we have maybe seen a homophobic remark by an employee in certain countries, and legally our hands were bound. We could not take action there. So sometimes there is that absolute legal roadblock there. On the other hand, what I found is that the world is actually much more open than most people think. Sometimes there are comments about India, for instance. India is actually one of our countries which is the most dynamic in terms of LGBT inclusion, where they've actually had a campaign to hire someone who's transgender, where they were the first to train their leaders in LGBT inclusion. And they decided to take on those conversations. But again, we all want to get to the same destination, but it's about the speed and the starting point that might be different. China is another example where there's this impression that things are very, repressive in China, and actually it's not as much the case as you would think. There are gay clubs in Shanghai and Beijing, but it's a bit discreet, and so we have to know, how do I go into that topic and make people locally feel reassured and gradually open up this conversation so that people know this is not a taboo subject and they start to understand why it's important. But it's a process. So it's really looking at discreetly at these different parts of the world.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that Eric mentioned about Swedish companies getting together in Poland, because we saw this years ago when Singapore, it was still criminal offence. The banks were told in Singapore that they could not have pride flags out to celebrate pride or anything like that. They were told they couldn't. But actually, they all got together and they said, we're going to do this. So the power of this collective, particularly when you're big global companies, and you can get together with other big global companies in a country, you can really make a difference because you can stand up to them in unison and say, no, we're going to do it. And that's what they did in Singapore.
And if I could jump in, I would just say, I think the framework you were pointing to, Simon, Sylvia Hewlett and Kenji Yoshino have this interesting little typology where they talk about companies that are the when in Rome types. They kind of go along with local cultural norms, and Eric, I think, had a great example of what that's like in Saudi Arabia, and then the midway point is what they call the embassy model, where companies say, within our walls, we are in charge. Our rules go along. So, we will be sure to pay everyone, compensate people fairly. We might change our healthcare benefits accordingly. And then there's the more active stage that they call the what do they call it? The advocate role, basically, where they'll have those quiet conversations in a very pointed way to try to change the external environment that their workers live in. And again, they're tying it to their own business case. So it's a great framework. And I think when you see it being played out in different companies are in different places, depending on the literal locations that they're in. So some might have that win in Rome model in places like Saudi Arabia, but be more engaged in places where they can. And I think Eric, the 2 points that Eric made are really important. I mean, one is that you can find you need to be able to find your LGBT employees to advise you on what to do and what they need, what they want. And I have been in companies where I have asked them, well, have you talked to your LGBT employees? And they're like, we don't know any. It's like, no, that's just implausible for most large companies. And then, secondly, the laws often are really not a problem for developing a very rich kind of political, cultural space, business space even. So I know that some of the places that you work, Justin, probably have laws that are not so great, but still have, thriving communities of LGBT people and small businesses, so it is possible for all these things to coexist. It's hard for development banks to wrap their heads around that. I'll just say, I've talked to a lot of people who are like, well, what do we do about these criminalization laws? Can we actually go in and talk about LGBT people? And in a lot of places you can. They're not all alike. Some places you cannot. So it's important to have a broader view of the local culture.
I have an interesting question towards the end now, and it's one that's very economic, very trade-related. Do you think that the principles of economic globalization and/or free trade, in the end, support our causes in the plural, or do our causes rather suffer from the numerous efforts to push back on globalization that we're seeing in the past few years? So is free trade or economic globalization a winning strategy for our cause, or is our cause rather going to suffer from efforts to push back globalization?
Well, I can just comment on the pulling back from globalization, because we're already seeing it happen in other areas with these the walls people are putting up now around their own countries. And I can see it's very much with the UK and the rest of Europe now, where the standards are becoming different. The UK's going on its own. It's doing all sorts of things. It's not actually often being kept up to the same high standard that the rest of the EU is. And I know Switzerland, I'm sitting in Switzerland, so I have to be a bit careful here. But I've seen already many, many things change in the UK because now they feel they're on their own and they can do their own thing. So I think, and you're seeing that more and more, I believe, because a lot of countries now are going, oh, we can do our own thing. We don't have to be part of this global scene anymore. So whether that has a negative impact for the LGBT community, I'm not so sure, but it's certainly having an impact on all sorts of other things.
I might chime in here, Simon, and maybe it's a bit of a microcosm, but I look at things like, you know, reshoring that's happening. You know, there's a real opportunity in countries for LGBT businesses to be a part of that. And the other thing, we're doing a much larger number of trade missions and education around exporting and strategic partnerships and so forth with businesses in other countries. And the really cool thing about that is we have a program at our U.S. Department of Commerce, which is called Commercial Services. It helps U.S. businesses export. What we're now doing is helping find in-country LGBT businesses that can grow their enterprise, not just with trade they may do with an LGBT-owned company, but could be a strategic partner, an end user, a distributor for any U.S. business that's now looking to export to countries in which we have affiliates. So I would make the case that globalization or global economy does have a benefit to us, because what we're taking into these other countries in terms of our exports, we're now creating a space for LGBT-owned businesses and other diverse businesses, but in this case, we're talking about LGBTQ, to be that end user and grow their own enterprise in their country through U.S. exports.
Well, thank you very much. I think that is this question answered. So we have also come to the end of this panel, sadly enough. It has been an absolute pleasure to be talking to all four of you. On behalf of Wybernet and Network, the Pink Economic Forum would like to thank you cordially for availing yourselves and making time for this webinar today. Evidently, I can't present you with a small gift right now, but I will do so online something later on. And I would say we have learned and heard a lot today, but I guess there is still a lot more to be discussed in the future, in time to come. And so I hope to see you again at another event sometime in the future. And thank you very much to all of you once again, and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.